What's up, Womack Nostalgia? Dave here with a reaction, analysis, explanation of Netflix buying Warner Brothers. This is a massive story in Hollywood and in the entertainment industry at large. There's a lot to talk about here and why this is a very bad development. We're going to go through all those reasons, but flat out, TLDR, this sucks. So the news here, of course, is that Netflix has agreed to buy Warner Brothers for $82.7 billion, $27.75 a share. You know, this is not a complete buy of Warner Brothers Discovery. This is a buy of Warner Brothers Pictures, the movie studio, Warner Brothers the television studio, as well as HBO and the HBO Max streaming platform. And this coincides with the original WD plan, which would be to break those companies back up and put the TV networks and the Discovery assets in a separate company. So Netflix would not be buying that stuff. We knew this was for sale just due to the debt load that WBD has been laden with. They made it very known that they wanted to be bought, and then they officially opened up that offer process. And there were three big players here: Netflix, Comcast, and Paramount Skydance. And going into this process, most people assumed that Paramount would be the one to come out victorious. Of course, Paramount Skydance, that merger has completed. David Ellison at the helm of that company, Larry Ellison, Oracle money behind the company. They have the wealth to buy anything they need to, but also have a strong enough relationship with the current presidential administration to not worry about any mergers running into antitrust issues with the government. And that is notable because, of course, that previously really damaged Warner Brothers during the AT&T merger that got held up for 2 years with the regulators 10 years ago or so, right? Most mergers are not successful, and when mergers go slow, they often hurt the company that feels it needs to do the merger, right? And all that's to say, I think most people expect the Paramount to come out victorious, and the general takeaway here is that any one of these people buying Warner Brothers, that takes us down from 5 legacy movie studios to 4. And of course, we had already lost one in 2019 when Disney bought Fox, and Fox as a separate, entertainment entity ceased to exist. But this is, I think, significantly more catastrophic that it's going to Netflix, and we can kind of get into that, right? Netflix has never done an acquisition, and they previously have been very proud of the fact that they haven't needed to buy anyone else. They haven't needed to jump into these live rights business, negotiations till very recently. That's not been their MO. Another thing that Netflix has been very proud to say, from Ted Sarandos' own words, that's not our model. And of course, that's referring to theatrical movie distribution. The fact that Warner Brothers, after the great success with the movie studio they've had this year with Sinners and One Battle After Another and Superman and Weapons, it's been a banner year, right, in terms of quality, in terms of commercial performance, up and down, right? The Conjuring, they've had an excellent year. The fact that they still need to sell after all that really sucks, right? And ideally, everyone would elect Warner Brothers to continue to exist as its own entity. But if they had to sell, Netflix buying them is frankly the worst case scenario, because you cannot trust Netflix at their word that they continue to operate Warner Brothers as they were. Inevitably, this is taking a buyer off the table in terms of entertainment. Less stuff will now be made now that Warner Brothers is under the Netflix umbrella. There's just no way that's not going to happen, right? That'll also mean less movies will be released in movie theaters. That has already been a problem that the theater business, the theatrical movie business, continue to go through. The industry does not need less and less product. And if Netflix is not able to maintain a rich, robust theatrical slate the way WB has been at the forefront of, alongside Universal and alongside Disney, that's going to continue this death spiral that we're going through. And yes, is Netflix wealthy enough and too big to fail at this point to necessarily need to care about something like that? For sure. But you know what this will hurt? Everybody else. If the movie business is not able to exist in a financial realm that makes a profit, then it's going to go away and not be nearly as big and significant as it's been. And that hurts everyone. That hurts the people that work in the industry, and it hurts all of us who are movie fans. The economics of making blockbuster films and putting them exclusively on streaming has been completely exposed as something that does not work, right? Warner Brothers themselves actually tried this during COVID, right? Remember when all the day and date releases happened in 2021 on HBO Max? The Matrix 4, Dune 1, everything they released that year, day and date, right? What does that do? Well, all it does is take money off the table and out of your pocket, because you're not going to recoup that in new subscribers, right? The math is not there. And yes, Netflix has billions in cash and no debt. Cool. They could stomach this, but they're not going to do it that way, right? The problem is not about Netflix and what becomes of the Warner Brothers assets. The problem is everybody else, right? And if Universal can no longer survive, right? It would, Universal under Comcast and Comcast NBCU, they probably would have loved to do this merger the most. I think it would have benefited them the most, right? Paramount, Skydance wanted to do it. They didn't need to do it just because they're so financially safe, right? With the Ellison fortune. It would have been nice if at least it went to Comcast, and combining Universal and Warner Brothers, the two most robust studios that aren't Disney. I mean, that still would have been a bummer, but that at least would have been a better outcome, right? Because then you would have had a really solid, big, studio in terms of their standing. Frankly, it would have been better if even Amazon did it, because Amazon has shown a more consistent interest in the theatrical model, and is actually planning to release the most movies they've ever released in theaters in 2026. Even that would have been better, but Amazon just doesn't have their ducks in a row. They continue to reorganize and restructure all the time. They just didn't really make sense as a buyer and necessarily needing it. And of course, they already bought MGM not too long ago, and they're only just starting to get that going with Bond, right? So them picking up all this additional IP from WB probably just not the right time for them, right? And Apple's strange, right? They don't have any library content at all. Getting all the Warner Brothers library stuff would have made a lot of sense for them, frankly. But they just didn't seem interested. And also of note is, of course, everything else they're buying, right? Netflix will be buying Warner Brothers Studios, the television studio. That television studio, of course, sells projects. It doesn't make everything for HBO Max. Some things made at that studio are on Apple TV Plus, for example. Netflix will now own the creation of Apple shows eventually. Now, the assumption of how things would go, right? If Netflix closes this deal, we thinking, the end of 2026 at the earliest. They have to wait for the official Warner Brothers company to separate in the middle of next year. So this is not happening anytime soon. And of course, the regulatory stuff isn't far from a certainty. But what we assume would happen here would be Netflix would honor all their pre-existing commitments. So any movies that WB is making that have theatrical and all that, traditional marketing spend applied and agreed to, they'll honor that. It's what happens after that, when Netflix has full control and no legacy commitments left. That's when you should be worried about the amount of movies ending up in theaters decreasing. And also Netflix not following a stronger theatrical window. Netflix is a fan of a 17-day theatrical window when they put anything in a theater. Of course, that's never a wide release, and that's never what a traditional marketing spend at the monetary level required to have a movie succeed in theaters, right? That's when the problems would start. But of course, the TV side of things, whatever happens to the studio, that's one thing. Again, there'll be less buyers here if Warner Brothers Studios and Netflix are now the same entity. They will not make as many shows as they used to make, despite the fact that they have seemed to say that they would operate HBO Max as its own entity. That doesn't make any sense, right? Why would they do that? Why would they buy all this stuff and not put it in Netflix, right? Of course, we know that Warner Bros. Previously licensed stuff to Netflix, both in the early days when Netflix got a lot of hay out of having other people's movies show up on their service, right? Big A-list movies that have been in theaters, been marketed, and they show up on Netflix, and Netflix gets to bear the benefit of getting new subscribers. Well, that's started to happen again as Warner Brothers wanted to make money. They started licensing their own material to Netflix again, right? There's some legacy HBO stuff that's already on Netflix right now, right? But why would they keep HBO Max siloed? In the case of, say, if Comcast had purchased WBD, combining HBO Max and Peacock would have made all the sense in the world. Peacock is only a domestic streaming service versus HBO Max is global. That would have been perfect, right? It would have bolstered up Peacock. Consolidation in the streaming service realm is not the same level of severity as in the theatrical side of things. That would have been great. But why would HBO Max continue to exist outside of Netflix? And then take it one step further, right? Think about how much stuff Netflix releases. How could they possibly release twice as much stuff on their own service. They wouldn't. We're gonna have less shows. We're gonna have less movies because it's all gonna eventually end up on one place. And HBO, it's a really good brand with decades of legacy and fandom. They would not foolishly get rid of the HBO brand entirely. But what's going to happen to that, really? HBO becomes a tile on Netflix. I mean, that's our best case scenario. We click on that tile and all the HBO stuff we like, it's still there. And hopefully they continue to employ Casey Bloys because they have a brain. We can hope. But HBO Max as a service, that will go away, right? Hopefully Netflix still wants to keep the Turner Classic Movie Library. But I don't see how they're going to make as many shows as they used to make when you have HBO's output and Netflix's output under one payer. This doesn't make any sense. So this is a drastic outcome. I'm not happy about this at all, clearly. And I just don't see how you could possibly trust anything Netflix says on the contrary. I assume at best they would backslide out of this once there was enough headroom and enough of the old contracts and legacy commitments were gone. So this is a really bad development. I hope the antitrust stuff comes in. Frankly, we know the Trump administration is close with Paramount. Maybe they're going to be vindictive and perhaps unfair about it, but honestly, for the greater health of the entertainment business, having the biggest streaming service acquire the third biggest streaming service and HBO Max, with Disney Plus in between them, maybe that's the justification you can use, even if frankly the theatrical concern is the bigger deal to me. I'm not sure. Of course, there's the EU antitrust as well, which is its own separate thing. We'll see. Obviously, this has got a long way to go. Paramount was very open in the press about how they thought this process was unfair and they were not pleased, and also, again, affirming their ability to close quickly. Perhaps the WBD board will remember what happened with AT&T and actually choose Comcast or Paramount in the end. I think that's probably wishful thinking at this point, given the official announcement today. But yeah, that's where we're at, and this is brutal. And I just don't know how anyone would be happy about Netflix being responsible for new DC movies. In terms of high-end filmmakers, I think this will push more high-end filmmakers towards Disney with the Fox Searchlight brand, and of course Disney proper, and also Universal, right? Remember when Christopher Nolan left Warner Brothers for Oppenheimer and the Odyssey? That could happen with other filmmakers as well, right? I think Greta Gerwig has regrets about doing that Narnia deal, given how much over tooth and nail she had to fight just to get a brief IMAX run for those movies, right? It's just people don't want to work at Netflix if they can avoid it. They only work for Netflix if they're the only ones who want to make the project. That's going to continue and probably get worse for them. So we'll see. Let me know where you at on this. What's your reaction? How you feeling about it? Let me know. And for more developments on this story as they come up, as well as movie and TV reviews, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.